Good evening. I'm very happy, ladies and gentlemen, to welcome you to our panel, to tonight's panel, Cosmopolitanism, Jewish and Postcolonial Perspectives. This panel is organized jointly by the Leo Baeck Institute London and by the BISA Institute for the Study of Antisemitism. My name is Daniel Wildman. I'm the director of the Leo Baeck Institute London. And firstly, my thanks go out to Dr. Brendan McGeever, the acting associate director of the BISA Institute, and his team for hosting again one of our joint events. It's really a great honor and a great pleasure to work together with the BISA Institute. How did tonight's event come about? Our starting point was the latest book co-authored by Professor Sander Gilman and Dr. Cassie Gelvin, Cosmopolitanisms, plural, Cosmopolitanisms and the Jew, published very recently in October 2017 with University of Michigan Press. Kathy and Sander discuss, or rather do a quite innovative close reading of the representations and self-representations of the so-called cosmopolitan Jew since the 18th century. The very different notions of this term, if I may call this a term, reflect changing conceptions of key terms of modernity, such as state, statute, or citizenship. Or in other words, this term was and still is used to talk about notions of belonging or not belonging in Europe since the Enlightenment. Sylvia Ben-Habib once argued that cosmopolitanism is primarily about universal rights, and that the Jews are its true litmus test. Or to put it in other words, maybe a bit more radical, you can't really understand at least modern European history without modern Jewish history. However, what happens to the notion of cosmopolitanism when we speak or when we look at another quite different legacy of European history, colonialism? What has this context, colonialism, to do with the changing conceptions of terms such as state, statehood, or citizenship? And this is the reason why we wish to discuss on our panel tonight also post-colonial theories and perspectives, to explain how cosmopolitanism speaks to other minority experiences which structure and inform modern British society very, very heavily. And this is the true reason why we wish to discuss two perspectives today. Jewish perspectives, if I may so say so, and post-colonial perspectives. And precisely these two perspectives can shed more light on the question, what does it really mean for us and our political system when our current PM Theresa May, is of the opinion that, I quote, "If you believe you are a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere." So how do we proceed today? First, Brendan will introduce our panelists, Professor Sander Gilman, Professor Kuminda Bambra, and Professor Brian Chenette. Unfortunately, Kathy couldn't make it due to the storm and to the snow, which is a problem here in the UK, so she's stuck, unfortunately, in Berlin. Secondly, the panelists will do a short presentation, and finally, Brendan will chair the debate we each have with you. We open the floor to questions and discussions about these presentations. So Brendan, please, over to you.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Brendan McGeever. I'm the Acting Associate Director here at the Pears Institute. Thank you, Daniel, for that introduction and for all your support in putting this event together. And thanks also for first coming to us with the idea to do this event this evening. I'd also like to thank Jan Davison of the Pears Institute and Karina Shitayat of the Leo Baeck Institute for all the efforts they put into making this evening possible. I'm delighted that we've been able this evening to bring together three leading scholars who over the last few years have really written some of the most cutting-edge works on cosmopolitanism, and indeed from very different disciplinary perspectives as well. Our first speaker this evening will be Sander Gilman, who is Distinguished Professor of Liberal Arts at Emory University in the United States. Among many other works, Sander is co-author, most recently, as Daniel mentioned, of the monograph Cosmopolitanism and the Jews. Second will be Brian Cheyette, who is Professor of English Literature at the University of Reading. And on the theme of our discussion tonight, Brian most recently has authored the monograph Diasporas of the Mind, Jewish and Postcolonial Writing and the Nightmare of History, which was published in 2013 by Yale University Press. And after Brian, we will hear a presentation from Gurminder Bambra, who is Professor of Postcolonial and Decolonial Studies at the University of Sussex. And again, Gurminder has written very, very recently a number of pieces on the topic of tonight's conversation, but the monograph, the edited collection rather, European Cosmopolitanism, Colonial Histories and Post-Colonial Societies, was published by Routledge in 2016. So each of our speakers will talk for approximately 15 minutes, and after which we'll open things up to the floor for discussion. So I'd now like to begin proceedings by welcoming Professor Sander Gilman. Sander, thank you.
About a decade ago, Kathy Gelman, who was one of my students at Cornell in the last century, approached me with the idea of perhaps doing a book on Jews as a sort of index of cosmopolitan thought in Europe from the Enlightenment to the present. It was a great idea because it was going to be a taking stock. 10 years ago, the notion that cosmopolitanism would be somehow or another a contested concept was something that neither Kathy or I expected. What we wanted to do, and I think the book wound up doing it, was to ask a question which is very rarely asked, which is when one starts to talk about the movement of peoples, especially the mass movement of peoples, what are people actually talking about? Because the one thing I can guarantee you is they're not talking about the mass movement of peoples. So when we started to look as the Jews as a sort of index of what it meant to be cosmopolitan, to be condemned to be cosmopolitan, to be unable to be cosmopolitan, to be nomadic, and what the nomad meant, because certainly in the 17th and 18th century in Central Europe, the gypsy, the legendary gypsy, the Sinti and Roma, were simply assumed to be, but what else? Jews. So we started to sort of look at the debates And they're the classic debates. They're the debates from Kant on about what it meant to be a citizen of the world, cosmopolitan, as well as a citizen of the city, of the polis, of the national state. And it turned out that certainly beginning in the 18th century, every time one read a statement about universal rights, there were always odd little footnotes, invisible footnotes that, however, became part of a discourse of who was permitted to be cosmopolitan and who was not permitted to be cosmopolitan, what it meant to be cosmopolitan, and indeed, who the bad cosmopolitan was. Now, some of you may have noticed that the last 10 years have shifted the debates. My colleague Daniel Wittmann quoted Theresa May at the Party Congress last year about the impossibility, the true impossibility of being both English and cosmopolitan. It struck me as kind of amusing. By the way, Theresa May just strikes me as amusing. I don't think I actually have to go on from that statement, right? It struck me as amusing because roughly a century before, George Bernard Shaw, who, needless to say, belonged to the other party, sent up Theresa May without even knowing Theresa May. Shaw lampooned his character Broadbent, the ultimate Englishman, and John Bull's Little Island, who decried everything and everyone who was not English enough. You, he says to his colleague in the club, you are thinking of the modern hybrids that now monopolize England. Hypocrites, humbugs, Germans, Jews, Yankees, foreigners, park laners, cosmopolitan riffraff. Don't call them English. They don't belong to the dear old island, but to the confounded new empire. And by George, they're worthy of it, and I wish them the joy of it. The empire that Shaw is gesturing on, of course, is the pink empire. The pink empire on which the sun never set. But when he starts to look at who is not English enough at the beginning of the 20th century, ironically, he evokes that, for me, fascinating group of hypocrites, humbugs, Germans, Jews, Yankees, and foreigners that make up the cosmopolitan structures of London. Now, Kathy and I worked very hard on this book to try to limit it, to really try to limit it. We wanted to look at Central Europe, we wanted to look mainly at German-speaking thinkers from Kant to Heine, from Heine to Marx, from Marx to Simmel, from Simmel to Heidegger and Thomas Mann, up to the last and most recent wave, at least, of Jews, however defined, from the former Soviet Union, who now dominate Jewish culture in a unified Germany. But what we found, of course, was something that was not at all surprising. The problems that we found about who could belong and who didn't belong, who was rooted and who wasn't rooted, became part of the discourse of 19th, 20th, and then 21st century Zionism. of Central Europe nationalism, of the new Brexit, and the new conservative parties in Eastern Europe. Why, I thought to myself, when in Warsaw there is a demonstration against asylum seekers 18 months ago, and again, by the way, 4 weeks ago, do they not only shout down with the asylum seekers, they shout down with the Jews? Why is it when in Charlottesville, Virginia, when the so-called alt-right, the neo-Nazis, neo-fascists, neo-Trumpians, demonstrated with their tiki flares, bad imitations of the Nazis in Nuremberg in 1935, do they not only decry foreigners, Mexicans, Muslims, but walk through the city of Charlottesville with its Jewish mayor shouting, "Jew will not replace us"? That is, what is it about the notion of movements of peoples, whatever those peoples are, in the 21st century, that brings a kind of atavistic response out of this long history of dealing with the cosmopolitan, in which the litmus test for that multiply faceted concept is, in point of fact, the Jew. And I leave it up to you, rather than the Nazis, to define the Jew. One of the things that we found was that there really wasn't a debate about cosmopolitanism from the 18th century up through the 21st that didn't evoke the Jews as a litmus test for something. My great friend Kwame Appiah, in probably the best recent book on cosmopolitanism, thinks of the Jews in medieval Spain as the perfect example of the cosmopolitan in the Middle Ages. It's a fantasy, but he buys into it. My former colleague Ben Anderson, in probably the most important book written on nationalism in the 20th century, Imagined Communities, evokes, of course, the same moment, the same structure on the Iberian Peninsula. It's not always positive, however. Stuart Hall, the late Stuart Hall, whom I have great fondness for, argued that the Jews could never be a cosmopolitan people because they didn't belong here, wherever here was. And coming from Stuart Hall, that was an extraordinary condemnation. What I hope we'll do today is to have a little further discussion with two of colleagues I have great respect for about how cosmopolitanism has been twisted and turned on its head over centuries, but is now even at greater risk for being manipulated as a term of opprobrium, as a term of the inability to ever belong. Not applied, by the way, necessarily to the asylum seeker or the migrant, who are seen really as transitory, but at those who wish then not to be transitory, who wish to settle. Are they then national citizens to be, or are they merely wandering, nomadic cosmopolitanisms? The question, of course, is a question which we will not be able to resolve tonight. But I can promise you, it's a debate that will be on the front page of the papers in the United States, in Central Europe, and certainly in the UK. And in the UK, certainly in the next 2 years, as Europe starts to think about itself without its British citizens, and Britain begins to wonder whether those citizens from the EU can ever be British enough. Thank you.
As Brendan said, I rather like Sandra and Cathy, I spent a decade trying to work out what cosmopolitan means, what diaspora means, bringing together Jewish and post-colonial perspectives in my book, Diasporas of the Mind. And when I was asked to speak here for about 12 and a half minutes, I've been told, possibly 12 minutes, 40 seconds, but we'll see. I decided to do a PowerPoint, just to simplify things. I think there's a golden rule with communication that if you actually know too much, you're a lousy communicator. And the good thing about PowerPoint is it simplifies things, so let's hope it does. So this is what I want to do in this presentation. I'm going to look first of all at Jewish cosmopolitanism, and I think Sandra and Cathy are right to pluralise it. I think it's actually very difficult to talk about a single cosmopolitanism, and I'll try and explain that, why it should be a plural. And I'm introducing this word taken from the late great Zygmunt Bauman, proteophobia. Now, proteophobia comes from Proteus, the shapeshifter, and it's the fear of shapeshifting, if you like. I think that's the way of thinking about it. So, we'll look at the cosmopolitan figure, if you like, as creating a figure that creates proteophobia. I don't see a Jewish and a post-colonial perspective as different, so I'll be bringing in Jewish cosmopolitanism and colonialism in relation to Franz Fanon and Albert Memmi, and then cosmopolitanism and post-colonialism, looking at Arendt, Appiah, who Sanders already mentioned, Sterlich, and Edward Said as well. So that's what I'm going to try and do. But you'll see, my son always tells me off, I have far too many words on a slide. He said, Dad, pictures. So I apologise for that. So this is starting with what Sandra called bad cosmopolitanism, or cosmopolitanism as a form of proteophobia. Now, one of the reasons you have to pluralise the cosmopolitan is it depends if you're looking at the figure from above or below, if you see the figure as above the fray, or as a figure who, as Sandra said, represents the masses, the refugees that are coming into the country, the strangers, those that as Sybil said, come today and stay tomorrow, or the Luftmensch, going back to beginning of the 20th century and the 19th century. Also the figure of the intellectual. So there's ways of thinking about the cosmopolitan, both in relation to the wretched of the earth, the masses, and as an elitist figure, the intellectual, the Luftmensch. And I quote here Finkelkraut because this is an example of protophobia. I mean, it's Finkelkraut, it's Theresa May, basically must have been reading her Alan Finkelkraut, because Finkelkraut dreads the Luftmensch, a Jew without substance in a state of zero gravity, relieved of what could have been his symbolic universe, his personal space. So there is a fear here, a fear of nothingness, as Theresa May evokes, that these figures that cross borders, these figures that defy categories, are, this is what creates this protophobic anxiety, amounts to nothing. You're only something if you're a citizen within a bounded nation state. So Finkelkraut here is evoking this protophobia in the imaginary Jew. Jeffrey Hartman, from a post-Holocaust perspective, I think shows Jewish anxiety with the historic figure of the cosmopolitan, which from the Central European German tradition in Sandra and Kathy's book. But Hartman looks back at these figures and says that cosmopolitanism has not succeeded as a creed. The attractive notion of a citizen of the world failed to overcome the suspicion that this type masks a self-defeating, deceiving Luftmensch. The worst of nationalisms arose in Germany, where the cosmopolitan idea of Bildung, or cultural growth, was strongest, and that fortifies our sense of its failure. So one way of thinking about cosmopolitanism from a Jewish point of view, which I disagree with, but that it's somehow been superseded, that it's, after the Holocaust, it no longer exists. This is Jeffrey Hartman's position, a kind of post-Holocaust position. It's also the position of Zionism as well, that after the nation state has been formed, that these free-floating figures, I mean, the point about the Luftmensch is that you need to turn them into something, you need to root him into the land and make him a proper citizen. So I disagree with all of this, but this is certainly a significant tradition. And Edward Said kind of picks up on this, where he says that the diasporic, wandering, unresolved cosmopolitan consciousness of someone who is both inside and outside his or her community is no longer just a Jewish characteristic. And here he's writing about Freud. So here, the idea that the Jewish cosmopolitan figure has been superseded, that the old has been replaced by the new, is very much part of the story, but I think is a problem. And I think, as Sandra's already shown, it's difficult to evoke cosmopolitanism and assume that this has nothing to do with Jewish history. So this is, if protophobia was the bad cosmopolitanism, this is the good cosmopolitanism. This is a term I've made up myself. I thought if Zygmunt Bauman can make up a term, I can make up a term. So protophilia. So the love of the shapeshifter, the person that defies boundaries and categories. So George Steiner is one of the great protophiliacs, and he says a great writer driven from language to language by social upheaval and war is an apt symbol for the age of the refugee. Now he was writing in the 70s. I think we can certainly apply that to our age. No exile is more radical, no feat of adaptation and new life more demanding. It seems proper that those who create art in a civilization with quasi-barbarism, which has made so many homeless, which has torn up tongues and peoples by the root, should themselves be poets and housed and wanderers across language. So here, the association between the figure of the cosmopolitan and the aesthetic, the artist, the poet, those that critique present-day society, is very much part of Steiner's position. It's also, as I'll show in a minute, part of Modernity and the Ambivalence, and this is Zygmunt Bauman's companion book to Modernity and the Holocaust. In both books, he shows that the figure of the conceptual Jew creates protophobia, which and has authoritarian boundaries imposed on them in their most extreme form by Stalinism and fascism, but also by the nation state as well, by the so-called liberal nation state. But in modernity and the Holocaust, the figure of the conceptual Jew leads to genocide. In modernity ambivalence, the figure of the cosmopolitan, the stranger, the figure of the Jew as the universal stranger leads to the critique of modernity, leads to all kinds of aesthetic, artistic, political avant-gardes, and so is essentially a good thing. Is a good thing, and it's out of this kind of time frame, the 19th and first half of the 20th century, that figures that we've heard about already: Freud, Kafka, Heine, Marx, Simmel, Bauman himself, Rosa Luxemburg, Hannah Arendt, who I'll mention in a minute, Adorno. These great figures were all figures of exile. Enzo Traverso, in a recent book, which I don't agree with, but I want to quote him because it kind of shows again one of the debates about cosmopolitanism and the Jews. He talks about the pariah people, the end of the pariah people, closes a long stage of modernity, and his book's called The End of Jewish Modernity, so his argument is very much on the tin can. A long stage of modernity in which Jews were the main seedbeds of critical thought in the Western world. So this is, I quote this because it goes back to Bauman and to Steiner. Jews were to think against the state, against accepted ideas, against orthodoxies and domination, and stimulated a creativity and critical spirit of exceptional power and scope. So this is very much protophilia. I think it's as idealized, even though it sees these figures as desirable, as the opposite, the mirror image, which sees the cosmopolitan as the stranger that can't be categorized and therefore has to disappear. Okay, so now that was a longish introduction. I'm now going to look at Jewish cosmopolitanism in relation to colonialism. So two figures in particular, Frantz Fanon and Albert Memmi. Now these were figures both that knew each other in North Africa, that Memmi was much more interested, I have to say, in Fanon than Fanon was in Memmi. But Fanon himself was very much preoccupied with the Jewish cosmopolitan figure, largely because he first thought about anti-black racism after reading Jean-Paul Sartre's Anti-Semite and Jew, and in his early work brought together anti-black racism and anti-Semitism, brought together fascism and colonialism, and very much thought about these not as separate histories, but as intertwined histories. Now, in his last book, his posthumous book, and his most radical, The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon thinks about the figure of the cosmopolitan, but for him, in this book, the figure is a real problem for him. And he says the anti-colonial intellectual has to tear itself away from the white man's culture, painful and difficult though it may be. If it is not accomplished, there will be a serious psychoaffective injury, and the result will be individuals without anchor, without horizon, colourless, stateless, rootless, a race of angels. Now this is Fanon's view of the deracinated intellectual, and of course this figure goes all the way back to Dreyfus. Colourless, stateless, rootless. And it's contrasted in a colonial or an anti-colonial context with the organic intellectual. The intellectual who, as he puts it, is a living part of Africa and her thought, who is very much part of the people, part of the masses, which is opposing colonialism. So the figure here of the cosmopolitan is someone who's above the fray, apolitical, and is a problem for someone like Fanon, who is an intellectual and who wants to root himself in the avant-garde of the revolution, the anti-colonial revolution. But this also is an anxiety for Fanon, and as I say, in his other works, he very much identifies with Jews and Jewish cosmopolitanism. But, and Al-Benani, I think, in his account of Fanon, gives us an insight into this kind of anxiety with the cosmopolitan figure in relation to colonialism. And then he says, I suspect that Fanon's sudden and intransigent Africanism roused new hostility against him. He might have shared the fate of those Jewish intellectuals who declared themselves universalists and are suspected of cosmopolitanism and even treason. And of course he's going back to Dreyfus here. They are not considered sufficiently legitimate members of the community to be permitted such aloofness. For an Algerian so late in the making, it was imprudent, to say the least, to put so recent a bond to the test. So Memi essentially is saying to Fanon that you've positioned yourself not unlike Jewish cosmopolitans. And we can see Fanon's response to that. So this is an anxiety within the colonial context. And what I'll do now is look at it, the way that this has been played out in relation to post-colonialism. Now, it's actually one particular strand of post-colonial studies, a kind of Marxian nationalist anti-colonialism that is particularly anxious about the figure of the cosmopolitan. And so I'm going to look at some examples of this. And Hannah Arendt, I think, actually fits very nicely into this in The Origins of Totalitarianism. Arendt was a dissident nationalist and in the end very much wanted Palestine to be divided between Jews and Arabs. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, we can see her nationalism here speaking. She says that the enthusiastic Jewish intellectual dreaming of paradise on earth, so certain of his freedom from all national ties and prejudices, was in fact farther removed from political reality than his fathers, who had prayed for the coming of the Messiah and the return of the people to Palestine. So Arendt here, again from a post-Holocaust point of view, is dismissing the Jewish cosmopolitan and the form of cosmopolitanism in Europe, Central Europe especially. And she's doing it from a nationalist point of view. And we'll see that this fits very, very well into post-colonial theory. So Appiah, who Sandra's already spoken about, talks about post-coloniality, he says, is the condition of what we might ingenuously call a comprador intelligentsia, of a relatively small Western-style, Western-trade group of writers and thinkers who mediated the trade in cultural commodities of Western capitalism at the periphery. So these figures are these post-colonial theorists. So he's talking about what's known as the Holy Trinity, Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak and Homi Bhabha. These cosmopolitan figures are completely dismissed by Appiah in this context. Derlich has similarly says post-coloniality is the condition of the intelligentsia of global capitalism. So, in other words, these figures are reinforcing global capitalism. They're not challenging it. And the only way that you can challenge global capitalism is from the view, from the position of nationalist anti-colonialism, in relation to the masses, by becoming an organic intellectual, not above the fray, not a Luftmensch, not floating above politics. I.S. Ahmed summarised this in a book called In Theory, where he distinguished between exiles and vagrants, principled exiles and depthless vagrants. So Salman Rushdie and Edward Said were both cosmopolitan vagrants because they were not in touch with the masses enough. Said's response to this is the position of a global humanist. And in the last quote, Said says, "I'm the last Jewish intellectual. You don't know anyone else. All your other intellectuals are now suburban squires. From Amos Oz to all those peoples here in America, I'm the last one, the only true follower of Adorno. Let me put it this way, I'm a Jewish Palestinian." And what Said did in his late works, and is actually right, and as a Palestinian and as a post-colonialist, he could have written about anyone and anything. He chose to write about Adorno, about Auerbach and Freud, and he foregrounded these Jewish figures in the name of exile and dissidence. And he does this, I think, because he wants to highlight those aspects of post-colonial studies, especially the history of fascism and anti-Semitism, and by implication, their impact on the Palestinian people, which had been missing from its purview. Okay, a quick conclusion. Firstly, the Cosmopolitan is a shapeshifter. It's shaped from above and from below, and can be applied to those with power and those who are powerless. So, as we've heard, it's a term that really needs to be pluralised. The Cosmopolitan is a haunting figure from the past, as we've seen, Finkelkraut and Hartmann, and a futuristic figure, a figure who celebrates the transgressive and the post-ethnic, so Bauman, Traverso, Steiner. Both time and space, therefore, are disturbed by the Cosmopolitan, both time and space. The Cosmopolitan is one way of thinking apolitical and above the fray, and a dreamer from a nationalist, anti-colonial position. This is what causes protophobia, above the fray, not to be categorised. And that's why Marxian-inflected post-colonial theories haunted by the cosmopolitan figure, both Judaized and not, whose protophobia threatens the certainties of nationalist anti-colonialism and is therefore deemed to be on the side of global capitalism. And finally, humanist post-colonial theory, Edward Said, which is a form of protophilia, argues that global humanism has superseded the foundational version of the Jewish cosmopolitan, the figure from the 19th and 20th century, who first critiqued and destabilised Western modernity. Now, I don't agree with this last position, but I think with that last position we need what Sander said about Jews still signifying cosmopolitanism, and also there are still Jews in the diaspora, there are still cosmopolitan Jews, and the idea that they are old and superseded by something new seems to me just wrong, ethically. Okay, thank you.
In the short presentation today, I examine questions or understandings of European cosmopolitanism and post-colonial critique, and what that means for how we might think about questions of citizenship and belonging in Europe today. I would suggest that these questions are increasingly urgent in a continent that seems driven to reimagine forms of atavistic nationalism for the 21st century. Interestingly, the European project came about as a consequence of European states wishing to make amends for a recent past that had seen 2 world wars and the genocide perpetrated by the fascist regime in Austro-Germany on European soil. It was never intended as a single state, but a common framework within which national differences could coexist without murderous intent. The associated intellectual project that was organised around the idea of cosmopolitan Europe, a Europe that would distance itself from its past by uniting in recognition of its deeper, long-standing commonalities and celebrating its diversity within those commonalities. Questions of diversity within Europe, however, are usually dealt with in 2 ways. Multiculturalism is used to refer to the visible differences of populations within states, whereas cosmopolitanism is used to refer both to the differences between states as well as an overarching commonality of culture. So cosmopolitanism then acknowledges national differences within a common European cultural framework, and at the same time posits its European cultural difference from those non-European others that are associated with the diversity that constitutes multiculturalism. And this diversity is presented as not being European. In this way, presenting an opposition between cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism precisely demonstrates the problems at the heart of the European project. That problem is whether its darker citizens can ever be understood as such. Sander ended his presentation by asking whether EU citizens would ever be British enough. I can tell him that despite as many generations of my family holding British passports as it was possible to have a British passport, I'm more commonly seen as a migrant or an immigrant rather than as a citizen. Now, the project of a peace-loving Europe as a cosmopolitan project was undergirded by a commitment to universal human rights, and it was that was the political antithesis of the earlier destructive nationalism. Cosmopolitan Europe, as Leo Baeck suggests, was to be motivated, and I quote, "It was to be motivated by clear ideas of inviolable human dignity and of the moral duty to relieve the suffering of others." So this is how the European project is set up. It's set up with universal human rights at its heart, where universal human rights are seen to be part of the expression of European values and European culture, and ultimately European civilization. And this duty to relieve the suffering of others was central to how Europe envisions itself. But the duty appears not to apply, however, when those others exist outside of commonly acknowledged European frontiers or commonly accepted understandings of being European. The crisis that faces us most starkly in recent times is that of refugees fleeing war, persecution, and the devastating destruction of their homes and homelands. While the conflict in Syria continues to be the biggest driver of people moving, ongoing violence in Afghanistan, Libya and Iraq, and serious abuses in Eritrea are also causing people to flee their homes and seek refuge elsewhere. Now, while many people would argue that the invocation of the word crisis should refer to those fleeing such devastation or those trapped within it, the majority of our media commentators and politicians rather refer to the crisis facing Europe, as we are called upon to aid these people in fulfillment of our commitments made under international laws and treaties. All EU countries are signatories both to the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the European Convention of Human Rights. This means that we are obligated by law, if not by moral conscience and our claimed common values, to accept people claiming refuge when they're fleeing conditions of war, violence and persecution. Indeed, as I mentioned, the cosmopolitan liberal order that is seen to define the European project is founded on a commitment to human rights. As such, if there's a crisis in Europe, it's a moral crisis associated with Europe's failure in the main to act in a manner consistent with what are claimed as cosmopolitan European values. This has implications for the European project as a whole, and perhaps has served to undermine it through the facilitation of forms of nationalism that we see dangerously on the rise all around us. What is being posited in discussions of the crisis of refugees, or of more locally here at home in terms of Brexit, is an idea of multicultural others against a cosmopolitan us, where our diversity is a source of unity, but the diversity of multicultural others is a source of threat. Even Habermas presents multicultural others as somehow associated with what he calls postcolonial immigrant societies. That is, the idea of the postcolonial or the multicultural is always associated with the body or the figure of that person who comes. But what that ignores are the histories that have already connected Europe with those parts of the world from which people are coming. And so what's not taken into account is that the histories of Europe are broader than the accounts of activities of what are presented as its native inhabitants. And the arbitrary reduction of history to contemporary European boundaries misidentifies the more expansive histories that are at the basis of Europe's current configuration. The idea of the political community as a national political order has been central to European self-understanding. Yet most European states were imperial states, as much as they were national states, and often prior to or alongside becoming national states. And so the political community of the state, historically, is much wider and more stratified than is commonly acknowledged. The history of the British state, for example, so if we take, in the context of Brexit and the way in which debates have been oriented around the returns to national sovereignty and what it means to take back control and so on, the history of the state is presented as a national history. And yet if we think about the history of the state, it begins with the Act of Union in 1707, the bringing together of the kingdoms of England and Scotland. Both England and Scotland had colonies prior to Union, and on entering into Union went on to establish the British Empire, which at its height covered a quarter of the Earth's land territory and governed 1/5 of its population. So in a sense, Britain has never had a national past. It's only ever had an imperial past. It may now have a project of purifying or potentially purifying its past as national, but that isn't an adequate representation of the past. This isn't simply a question of history, however, because it also has implications for the politics of the present. Because the debates in the present have been about, if you can demonstrate that you have a history of belonging to the nation, then you're understood as having rights in the present. However, if Britain wasn't a nation but an empire, then those who have histories in that imperial polity is a much broader body of citizens than is being purified at the process. So the failure to acknowledge these multicultural histories of colonialism and empire as pertinent to our understandings of the contemporary political state can be seen to have many political repercussions, not least those that are looming large in the aftermath of Brexit, or rather of the Brexit referendum, because Brexit hasn't yet happened. The inclusions at the national level, however, are curiously inverted at the common European level, where all unbounded histories are assigned to the histories of individual states. So this paper, or this short talk, comes from a much sort of longer research project, in part where I also talk about the way in which the very establishment of the European Union is commonly presented as the coming together of states that are nations, but all the states that were at least originally part of the European Economic Community were not nations but empires. And so what you had was not the emergence of a transnational federation, but a trans-imperial federation, where the EEC also established its coloniality through the idea that Africa would be brought as a dowry to Europe. So Pierre Hansen and Stefan Jonsson have written a wonderful book called Eurafrica, in which they argue for the way in which Robert Schuman, for example, talks about bringing Africa as a dowry to Europe to actually enable the European Union to get established. So I can talk much more about this, but the key issue that I want to end with here is that the way in which the European Union, through its Cosmopolitan project, thinks about colonialism is to make colonialism the past property of individual nation states. And this is to be displaced by a new narrative of European integration that would be free from the stain of colonialism. But by erasing the colonial past, the post-colonial present of Europe and European states is also disavowed. And I'll conclude by saying that I think we need to better understand the history of Europe and the European states within Europe if we are to have any possibility of reimagining a politics for the present that takes us away from the return to an atavistic populist politics and moves us instead towards a post-colonial cosmopolitan one.
Thank you, Sander, Gurminder and Brian, for three really terrific papers that we will hopefully be able to think about and discuss in an open way with all of you. So we have a good amount of time for questions. We're going to take them in small groups. So if I could get a show of hands, please, we'll maybe take 3 or 4. Okay, we've got 1, 2, 3, and 1 more. One at the back there. I think there's one at the back as well. Okay, 4. So the gentleman with his hand raised. Thanks, John.
How does the Cold War and the Bandung Conference and the decision by the Lombard powers to refuse to admit the Israeli delegation to that conference inform Jewish intellectual thought about cosmopolitanism? And why hasn't the Balfour Agreement been mentioned in the conversation?
I think there was someone who...
Firstly, thank you all for your talks. Gominda, you mentioned a very interesting point about the European Union being a collection of empires historically. And do you think that the fact that it is now a collection of nation states going forwards, is that something to do with its current stagnation or countries on the brink of falling out of it? And how does this collection of nation states move forwards without their former empires? Thank you.
Is there any...
Sorry, if you just wait a second. Sorry, the microphone is just coming. Thanks.
Is there any mileage, do you think, in looking at the very different ways in which the terms cosmopolitanism and internationalism are used? I can't help thinking that the whole of the international socialist and communist movement has been ignored, and it did play quite a role in 20th century history. I also, sort of contra fanon, remember very well in Francophone West Africa in 1968, hearing a young man say, "Le vrai progressiste n'a pas de pays. The true progressive has no fatherland." Che Guevara didn't die in Cuba. The internationalism from Marx onwards was thought of virtuous, forward-looking. It wasn't about shape-shifting, whereas cosmopolitanism has nearly always been pejorative. So I wonder if there is any mileage to be gained in thinking about that.
And there was one at the back. Someone's got their hand raised.
Thank you all very much for your wonderful talks. On the title, I guess, and this is for all speakers, when you say the Jewish perspective, what do you mean by that? Are we saying the post-colonialism, bourgeois, the same we would define Zionism and that conversation? Or are we looking at the Jewish people in its text and theory and ideology? And if so, how is that projected through the discourses this evening?
Okay, so we've got 4 questions, some of which are, I think, addressed to all of you, but others which were not to everyone. So, do you want to start? Brian, do you feel able to come in?
I can I'll get things rolling. But these were great questions, but also broad, mainly broad questions. Balfour is about nation building. So is the opposite of cosmopolitanism, and as I said, I think one way of thinking about the cosmopolitan tradition is that it's come to an end, and this is Enzo Traverso's view, and 2 reasons for that in his view. 1, the state of Israel, which is about nation building, and 2, the Holocaust, which means that that particular and those particular Jewish cosmopolitans have died. I don't think that's correct, but I don't think Balfour is a part of this. The true progressive has no fatherland, I think, is a great quote. Is a really great quote. I wish all of these Marxist anti-colonial nationalists who argue that they're speaking on behalf of the wretched of the earth would understand that quote, because from one post-colonial perspective, and you know this better than me. The only game in town is nationalist anti-colonialism, and there's no room at all for the cosmopolitan figure, for the internationalist in that sense. Jewish perspective, I think, is a very interesting question, and a lot of the time we're talking really on the level of discourse. We're talking about the way, and Sander did this, and will speak for himself, the way that the cosmopolitanism has been Judaized. It's from the outside. Now, I think it's not just an outsider thing, because, as I said, in relation to the Luftmensch, from a national Jewish position, from a Zionist position, the Luftmensch also needs to disappear. The diaspora has to disappear. That's what the negation of the diaspora means in relation to a national discourse. So I think from a Jewish perspective, we're still talking about national discourses versus transnational discourses, cosmopolitan discourses. And I think what I wanted to show was that there was an overlap between the Jewish national perspective and anti-colonial national perspective.
Let me pick up a little bit on that, because one of the things we tried to deal with in great detail in Cosmopolitanisms and the Jews is, on the one hand, the movement of what one can call national cosmopolitanism, Kant's notion that you could be both a national citizen and a citizen of the world, into what is really incipient fascist nationalism in Germany. But the other side of the coin, and you raised it, is the question post-1919. We are now celebrating, well, that's certainly the wrong word, we are memorializing the Bolshevik Revolution, is the rise of the Comintern, about so-called international communism. What we know, of course, is that certainly in that moment after the death of Lenin, the destruction of the notion of an international communism by Stalin in his destruction of Trotsky, literal murder of Trotsky, made the whole notion of the Comintern a kind of hollow thing, which continued, by the way. I remember very much sitting in Paris in the 1970s with people who thought of themselves as French Marxists who belonged to the Comintern, right? And they were the same notions of global cosmopolitans. Of course, Stalin destroyed the Comintern by introducing a phrase, by the way, which he, of course, did not coin, of the notion of the ruthless cosmopolitan, who is the Jew. So I think one has to be very careful about idealizing Marxist notions of cosmopolitanism. Maybe, I would agree with you about Trotsky up to the 1920s. Stalin never, and Lenin was such a hypocrite in terms, for example, of his nationalism policy in the Soviet Union. And I'm happy to discuss that with you all, including the nationalism of the Jews. He creates a Jewish state, right, in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev. Talk about Israel. Gorbachev is the first Jewish state of the 20th century. All right? So I get the nostalgia for Marxism, which I had to purge myself with. I had an intellectual enema to get rid of it. Is something one should really lose quickly. Nothing happy about Marxism as when it becomes communism in the Soviet Union.
I wasn't advocating it, I was just saying there was a lot of it about.
There was, and it was, and by the way, if one can think about that period of time after the collapse of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the Comintern was used almost exclusively as a vehicle to get Western exile support for the Soviet Union. And it was, in point of fact, exactly that moment in the early 40s, that the notion of the rootless cosmopolitan appears.
The only happy Marxist history is the film The Death of Stalin, which I recommend.
Which is funny.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so to move from cosmopolitanism as understood there, I mean, in a way, the way in which I've been engaging with the term cosmopolitanism is really to think about it in the way in which European intellectuals have appropriated the term as a byword for thinking about the European project. So in the post-war period, Habermas and Baeck established an idea of cosmopolitan Europe, in part because the nationalism had become such a destructive force that nationalism wasn't possible, and so they had to refashion something as cosmopolitan. So the very construction of Europe under the term cosmopolitan was also associated with this idea that Europe established peace on the continent. It was in 2012 the Nobel Peace Prize Committee gave the EU the Nobel Peace Prize for 50, 60 years of peace and so on. And yet, as my colleague P.O. Hansen has pointed out, that the very birth of the European Economic Community occurred alongside the Franco-Algerian War, which led to the death of over 1 million people on European soil and in Algeria. So the idea that the European Union has a history of peace, when in fact it's forged in a violent independent struggle, seems a bit contradictory. But just to give you a couple of other points there as well, I mean, because you're asking the question about the shift from empires to nations. When the EEC was established in 1957, Algeria was still a colony, or it was a département of France. And so it was a member of the EEC in 1957. Not many people know this, but the boundaries of the EEC included Algeria. Algerians had all rights that all the other 6 member nations had in the EEC except for 2. Black Algerians, and here I'm talking about black Algerians, not the pied noir or the white French who were living in Algeria. Black Algerians weren't given the right of the freedom of movement across the other 6 nations that all other EEC citizens at the time had. And secondly, black Algerians were not to be paid wages or social insurance at the same rate that the rest of the EEC citizens were to be paid. So you can see in this way that the very establishment of the EEC is a colonial and racial project at the very outset. So it's not something where colonialism is to the side or race is something that comes in subsequently. The very formation of it, it's in the DNA of the EEC. As decolonisation happens over the late 50s and 60s, one of the problems is that decolonisation of most, particularly African countries, occurs after the establishment of the EEC. That means that those countries remain with independent relationships to those former colonial powers through things like the treaties of Lomé and Yaoundé and so on. So they don't ever actually manage to break free completely from it, but remain subordinate and subordinated to Europe. As the new countries join the EEC and it eventually expands to becoming the European Union, they share in the wealth and the development that has occurred in the EEC, which has only been possible as a consequence of the appropriation of the land, labour and resources of the former African colonies and so on. So there's this way in which the European Union remains, I think, very much a colonial project to the extent that it has been built on the basis of the land, labour and resources of many African countries. It hasn't ever fully acknowledged that or acknowledged what the debt would be. Just one last point, if I may. This issue of when, in the context of the crisis for refugees and the idea that in order to address the disproportionate burden that was being placed on Italy and Greece, that other countries should play their part in taking refugees. Poland, for example, flatly refused. And when the argument was made in part that, it's partly as a consequence of the colonial histories of other European countries that, we ought to be addressing this issue, Poland said, well, we didn't have a colonial history, so why should we partake of this? And my response to that would be that you can't claim the European Enlightenment if you're not also willing to take responsibility for the European slave trade. That the two go together. If you enter the European Union and you take the benefits and the rights that are associated with being part of the European Union, then you have to take the responsibilities that come with that as well. And so in this way, I think that shift from empires to nations hasn't quite happened, or even if it's happened with the constituent states, the entity itself, I think, remains a deeply colonial entity and certainly a racialized entity. And there were different ways of thinking about things, both at the time. I don't know if you've come across Gary Wilder's book, Freedom Time, in which he talks about the way in which Césaire and Senghor had been thinking about the decolonisation, not simply in terms of these countries having forms of national self-determination and just becoming separate, but an attempt to create a francophone federation in which France would be humbled into being on an equal level to the other countries, so that you create a very different form of association. And there's something, I think, quite powerful in that notion, that it didn't simply have to be the reproduction of existing hierarchies, but there could have been a transformation, but that this wasn't something, certainly, that France didn't want at the time.
Fanon starts The Wretched of the Earth with this idea of the tabula rasa, the blank page, and to some extent, and precisely because he didn't want freedom from colonialism to mean the rebirth of nation states throughout these various empires. So Fanon took a cosmopolitan position very much at the beginning of that.
But one also has to add that, of course, France uses this notion of francophonie as a way of creating a kind of pseudo-empire. I think, of course, of de Gaulle showing up in Montreal, right, and saying to the Québécois, you know, you're really French, right? You're not Canadians at all. And I will point out to people, because nobody ever thinks of that there is a colony in North America. It happens to be a French colony in North America. It is a group of islands in the St. Lawrence called Saint-Pierre et Miquelon. And when the people of Saint-Pierre et Miquelon 3 years ago tried to establish some kind of local control, Paris sent the gendarmerie in to repress it. And it didn't make the New York Times at all, because of course they would do that, as they do regularly in Francophone Africa. So let me just add one more thing, because I got interested in this discussion about Balfour and the Jews and the establishment of national states. The major precursor in every way of the European coal and steel community was, believe it or not, the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson, in his second inaugural, talked about America as the ultimate cosmopolitan state. He had the notion then of what individual national identity as established. In other words, he was really for the creation of national states, and certainly both the Kurds and the Jews went out empty-handed at Versailles. But what is fascinating is that the League of Nations was supposed to be that cosmopolitan entity. It was supposed to be the EU that brought together all of the new ethnic nations that were created after Versailles together to do what? To stop the possibility of war. And when you read Wilson, and one really should read Wilson on this, one of the things one realizes is that almost all the people who were involved after 1949 in establishing the European steel and coal community in Germany, in France, and then in the central countries who came together were people who were either young adjunct secretaries in Versailles, or were in the governments that were created after Versailles, right? So that problem, which is a tension about the colonial and the national, and the illusion of spinning off national states with no history, has a long, tradition in Europe.
Okay, we've got one question down here. Any other hands? Second one here.
There's a gentleman at the front.
In your conversations,
Sorry, can you hold on a second, actually?
Sorry.
We'll come to you next.
I was just wondering whether you thought cosmopolitanism, in a sense, could lead to political apathy on a domestic level of politics, because Obviously, if you have a decreased national consciousness, then you feel less responsibility for whatever goes on in your own country. And I'm only asking this because I actually sort of sense this sentiment, because I'm also from Hungary and I have a lot of students are all over the world now. And, I have a lot of Hungarians here studying in London, and I was just, and we don't really, I can also feel it on myself that I'm just not as involved or engaged anymore in whatever happens in my own country. And yeah, I was wondering what you thought about that, what that means for domestic politics.
Thank you. In your conversations, you mentioned the keyword DNA. I don't think you mentioned it in a scientific context, but about 2 years ago I walked over to the New Crick Institute and I asked the question, how many ethnicities are there on this planet? And the answer was between 4,000 and 5,000. And I said, how many races are there? And I was told there was one, Homo sapiens. If we average the number of nationalities that we have about 150. That works out at 30 ethnicities on average in a nation. Are we not seeing the breakdown of many nations and the rise of tribalisms and ethnicities and populisms associated with tribalisms as being part of the sort of micro-politics that is happening around us? And also, I'm very worried sometimes when I walk into schools that students talk about race. Races. Even every national newspaper, bar one, The Times, spells anti-Semitism incorrectly in their articles, with a hyphen and a capital S, which implies that Jews are a race. I'm glad to see it spelled correctly by the Pears Institute. It's something we have to read about. And one has a battle constantly. But my question is, are we but seeing this rise in tribalism as post-colonialism?
Jan, there was a question.
I'm a scientist by profession, and very early on in my career I realized that we are too insular in our own disciplines. We needed more to collaborate with other people. I therefore began to work interdisciplinary, that automatically meant eventually international. And that, I found, was very productive. I went to great lengths to make sure there was no scientific empiricism. So, and I found that when I consulted my friends in Scotland about their breakaway, all my scientists got digested. Most scientists can't against Brexit, and we're all internationals. But so are we as a scientific community cosmopolitan?
There's one more, Jan, just.
Given rates of urbanisation, the increasing amount of people now living in cities and projected to live in cities right out to 2050, I think it'll be 75% of people live in cities. The inherent cosmopolitan character of cities. What do the panel think about that almost post-national consideration, a post-national feature of experience? For the majority of people living in cities, there is a sense of, and perhaps something I'd be interested to know your view on whether it competes with an idea of multiculturalism, of coming to cities in order to throw off identity rather than to hold identity. I think it was Bauman that said we're already cast in a cosmopolitan condition, it's just that we haven't yet created the institutes in order to uphold that. Do you see that as a stage of perhaps institutions which help to enable cities to function and cosmopolitanism to function as a result?
Yeah.
Okay, who would like to go first this time?
What is your start?
Okay. Thank you again for that collection of questions. I think in terms of this issue of the breakdown of nations, one of the things that we need to think about is what the genealogy of nations themselves is. So often when we talk about nations within at least sort of social scientific accounts of the emergence of nations, they seem to come about in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia, and then you have the modern French, the French Revolution that creates the French state, and you have forms of nationalism that bring Germany together and Italy in the 1870s, 1860s, and then eventually other places become nations and so on. But again, here I'd like to sort of offer a different understanding, because the countries that we commonly assume as nations were not nations, they were empires. And to the extent that they were understood as successful nations, what made them successful as nations was the fact that they had imperial hinterlands. So it was only because there was the possibility of extracting resources from other places in order to build up stuff within the centre that they were understood as successful. To the extent that nations now don't have empires, we see that the nations are no longer successful as nations. And so it begs the question, are the only successful nations those with empires, or those that were actually imperial? And we've confused the two forms. And so in that sense, I would suggest that the majority of nations that emerged as a decolonial project. So it's only after decolonisation that you actually began to have nation states in the world, as opposed to imperial states and colonial territories and so on. So in that sense, I think there's a sort of a category error, if you want to put it that way, in terms of what we understand as nations. And then also with the issue of ethnicities and race, I mean, with all of these things, I mean, I don't think, I'm not a scientist, and so I'm happy to have that conversation with scientists and so on, but if race doesn't exist, I don't think ethnicities exist either, that these are all social constructs, and they are social constructs which have particular sorts of power in the world at different times. And what we're seeing at the moment, I think, particularly in the context of Brexit, was in part, if you think about when Britain joined the European Union, it joined it in 1973. This is a time when a lot of the decolonisation of empire had happened. So Britain was in the process of becoming a small island. So having covered 1/4 of the world's Earth territory, it was now becoming the islands that it is. But by joining the European Union, it managed to regain a status on the world stage that it had lost effectively. But entering the European Union meant that it never had to deal with decolonisation. It never had to deal with the trauma of going from being an empire to becoming a small nation. And in part, I would suggest that what we're seeing at the moment are the death throes of empire with Brexit, because the resentment that's come out in relation to this is very much a sort of imperial resentment. It's this idea of we want to go back to when we were great. Well, what constituted that greatness? Dominating others. Those others no longer wish to be dominated. I mean, I don't think they wanted to be dominated then either, but now they're in a greater position to sort of argue that. And if we also sort of look more locally, the very fact that over the last few years we've had referenda for Scottish independence, Wales has, gained further forms of devolution. The issue in relation to Ireland, I think, is deeply interesting, and Ireland precisely points to the impossibility of Brexit emerging. But the very breakup of Britain is also a consequence of the loss of empire. The only thing that made Britain Britain was empire. If it doesn't have empire, then what makes Britain? So I think, and just one other little quick thing on the cosmopolitanism and cities. I mean, one of the things that I always find, I've lived in Brighton and in Birmingham. Brighton is a cosmopolitan city, Birmingham is a multicultural city. And there's something there about the way in which we understand the nature of what constitutes difference and how those differences are sort of thought about. And why is Brighton cosmopolitan but Birmingham multicultural? I mean, when I say that, for anybody who knows the cities, I guess you know what I mean. So how is that already part of what we understand those concepts and what that goes on to do?
No, I can say something on that.
Yeah, it strikes me that one of the problems that one has is that we tend to think of, and I mentioned Wilson, we tend to think of words like nation, nation state as concrete in the world. And I mentioned Benedict Anderson's notion of imagined communities, and this is freshman government, right, courses, which is that nation states exist because the people in the nation state have a kind of symbolic relationship one to the other. I'll give you my favorite example. I used it in class all the time. If we go to Scotland, I will actually see the Saltire. I will actually see the Scottish flag. I see it all the time. I see it on clothing, I see it in backpacks and everything else. I live in London, I live in the East End. The only time I see the English flag is football. Right? That is, the Scots have, through this symbol, whether you're Irish Scot or Italian Scot, Highlander or Lowlander or a mix of all of the above, a symbolic notion of that state they're identifying with. So when we talk about nations, that's what we have to talk about. And then this notion of being in a diaspora. How do you identify as Hungarian when you're in a diaspora? You do it symbolically. You do it symbolically. And in the sense of the diaspora, it's great because then you can really pick and choose the symbols with which you function, right? I'm not going to even risk thinking about the symbolic register that you would think of yourself in the Hungarian diaspora. But that is, for me, really, really, really important because then when one talks about diasporic communities, about the Jews, for example, the Israelis in Berlin, the Russian Jews who have gone to Berlin and whose kids now live in New York. Then you start to say, what is the symbolic register of being Jewish in that context? And it's very varied. It means different things in different national contexts and in different diasporic contexts. So, for example, we have a fantasy that we are permanently X, but we are always dynamically X. It's always changing. And in cities, and this is Saskia Sassen's great work on the global city, cities not just in the 20th century, starting in the 19th century, with the beginning of mass urbanization. Where? Right here! Right here! Right? And then, very end of the century, Berlin. Then certain symbolic registers start to create themselves in the cities. And you then have this very strong distinction between city dwellers and country dwellers, between people who can be cosmopolitan and people who have to be rooted, right? I can talk about Germany in those terms, I can talk about Great Britain in those terms, I can talk about Brazil in those terms. So one has to be very careful about thinking, first of all, that our situation now is unique. It's not. And that it is static. It is never static, even though, and I always quote Robert Frost in this, right? The notion that we have these walls that contain our nation states made of these huge rocks. As Frost points out, every winter those rock walls collapse, and every spring the farmer has to rebuild them. And that's what we have to always do with national identity and our place in the nation state.
Okay. Thank you. I want to start with a really an important book by David Hollinger called Post-Ethnic America.
Yep. And
Hollinger wrote a very good book on Jews and science as well. And science very much as an international discipline. Cosmopolitan discipline. Now, what Hollinger shows in this book is that race and ethnicity are not, one way of thinking about them, which is, I think, incorrect. Race has a biology, ethnicity is purely a social construct. I think that's incorrect. And what Hollinger shows is that in the United States, but this has been very much exported, there's a kind of ethno-racial pentagon, a way of thinking in terms of race and ethnicity. And this is institutionalized in the States, but as I say, has been exported to Europe. And it works as follows. It's an ethno-racial pentagon, so 5 ethno-races. And in racial terms, they are black, brown, yellow, red, white. But what's come out of that is a form of multiculturalism, so ethnicity. And that is translated into African American, black, Hispanic American, brown, Asian American, yellow, Native American, red, Caucasian, white. So exactly the same. And what he shows is that the form of multiculturalism, the kind of pluralism that comes from the ethno-racial pentagon, is incredibly restrictive. And that's why the race and ethnicity circulates race all the time. Now, Hollinger's answer to that is what he calls a form of rooted cosmopolitanism, which means that you're engaged with domestic politics, but from a cosmopolitan perspective. And that's what he argues for in relation to post-ethnic America. It's his answer to the rise of tribalism as well, especially American tribalism. He anticipated the kind of Trump voters, the kind of people that voted for Trump, and sees them as a kind of tribalism, and the lack of a cosmopolitan American identity has led to this, I think, in Hollinger's viewpoint. I think that the great thing about cosmopolitanism is that it does force us to think outside of the ethno-racial pentagon, and these quite restrictive identities which become fixed, which are related to the past and the past only, which are a form of descent, not consent, which aren't performative, which aren't affiliative, but simply put people in boxes. And Hollinger's view, and I agree with him absolutely, is that you can't, it doesn't allow mixing. It's a form of what Zygmunt Bauman would call mixophobia, which brings us to the city. Because what Bauman argues about the city, I mean, he argues 2 things. He says that the city is an ambivalent place where people that live in cities are both mixophobics and mixophiliacs. So, and Bauman talks about the city as open and cosmopolitan, as you said, but he also points out that the city is made up of all kinds of restrictive areas, which he calls ghettos, and goes back to the history of ghettoization. But if you think of every major city, there are parts of every major city with these areas, these no-go areas. And so our urban cosmopolitan residents like myself also look at these other no places, and that kind of defines you as well. You know, that's where you're not. That's who you're not. So I think the city, I'd love to think of London and these great cosmopolitan cities as purely a form of mixophilia, but they're also a form of mixophobia as well. They're both.
Okay, can I just put one quick footnote? The nice example of Hollinger's thesis about these rigid boxes is that if you look at the discussions of the Jews in about 1850s, the Jews are black. And it is only after World War II in the United States that Jews become white. Those are social categories. But they're literally, if you look at paintings and at caricatures, they're literally seen as black. And it's very difficult for us in the 21st century to imagine Jews as anything but white. These are really interesting boxes.
Well, I was very tempted to pick up on Sanders' contribution about Scottishness, but I'm going to resist all temptations because, unfortunately, we have run out of time. I want to thank you, the audience, for coming out on this freezing December evening, for braving Scottish weather, as it happens, and for asking such insightful questions. And sorry to those of you who had your hands up but didn't get a chance to ask your question. And above all, of course, I want to thank our three speakers, Sander, Brian and Gurminder, for such a really extraordinarily rich set of papers that did what? That traversed disciplines, crossed the centuries, and yet somehow made all of this feel absolutely urgent and central to these difficult times that we're living through today. So I hope you'll join me in thanking our speakers for a really excellent presentation.
Well, no,